So we're several years old, so we're still a relatively new company. As you can see here, where it says by leveraging open APIs. So this right here presents the first challenge for us, is we use APIs provided by both Google and Microsoft, and they, being that they're third-party APIs, they're subject to a lot of change. So we have to build a lot of robustness around our process. So when we were founded in 2011, there was a lot of change. Most of Google's APIs were still in beta. As we're moving into working with Office 365, a lot of their APIs are still in beta as well. So there's a lot of things that we have to do to make sure that we have a lot of very strong processes built around our testing and our coding. As well as we've got 32 million end users. So that in and of itself as well provides a unique challenge for us, is we've got an application where we can test it 10 million different ways, but are we even going to hit a small percentage of the way the users hit it, right? So 105 team members, about half of those are the engineering team. Engineering is based down here in Atlanta, sales and marketing based up in New York. So again, with support being in a different location in engineering, that yet again provides a little bit of a challenge for us that, and I'll talk a little bit about this. So moving on. So as we go through, I'm sure that all of you have read a ton of QA books, engineering books. Bruce Lee is actually my favorite author. He writes a lot of very good QA books. He's got a really good quote that's always stuck with me. Absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is specifically your own, right? So read everything you can get your hands on. Follow folks, follow their blogs, read and try to get an understanding of the way they do things, and try it. Try it in your organization. Try something new, even if it's for a small project, even if it's for just something that's maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Because until you try something new and until you try to make it your own, you never know if you're going to succeed or fail. So just something to keep in mind as we go through this. Again, if you guys see something, please challenge me, please ask questions. Quick agenda. So we're going to go over some common Agile QA problems. As I list out the ones that we have had specifically at Better Cloud, I'd like to hear from you guys. Perhaps problems that you're having transitioning from Waterfall to Agile, or going from just a small dev shop trying to figure out how to make QA work. We've got so after the problems, we're going to talk about why we implemented acceptance test-driven development. So why we felt that it was going to be a good solution for us. We're going to talk about the results. So right now we have been running ATDD for about 8 months. So we've had a chance to push through a number of very large projects. We went through in February. It was about a year-long process of rebranding, coming out with brand new SKUs, changing our products. So it was a good chance for us to really put our new processes to task. We're going to go over some tips, and again, I'd like to hear some thoughts from you guys in terms of, challenges that you may be having, and let's try to walk through those, see if we can't discuss them. And then questions at the end. I'd rather you guys ask questions throughout the whole thing. All right, so some common issues why QA breaks down in Agile, right? So the first one was really the biggest one for us that we were having a problem with, is QA was kept out of the loop. We had sprint planning sessions, we had requirements writing sessions, user story creation sessions. It involved the product owner, it involved tech leads. Yeah, just those two guys, right? QA was not involved in that discussion. So what we wound up having is the automation team, especially on the QA side, was always coming up in the very end. They were always a sprint behind, if not 2 sprints behind, in writing their tests. They are always trying to figure out what exactly is going on, right? So, everyone here have that problem? Yes? I understand that. Excellent. Well, not excellent. I wish we all did not have that. Right. Another thing is something that I've seen in several companies is QA doesn't complete their acceptance tests until the sprint starts, or they're writing their tests while the sprint is going on. And what this causes is a huge spike in effort at the very beginning from the QA team, having to learn the functionality, having to estimate their tests, as well as now trying to play catch up from development who is several leagues ahead of them in the code, and that creates this huge backlog problem, right? Another problem is dev and QA out of sync. So if you follow TD or some form of that where dev is creating unit and integration tests, if development and QA are not talking, you're going to have a lot of overlap there. You're going to have a lot of work where QA is testing the same thing that dev has unit and integration testing. And if you're a small team like us, where we've only got 3 devs, 1 manual tester, and 1 automated tester per sprint team, having overlapping testing, it blows everything out of the water. And this one right here, a lack of understanding or inability to qualify when QA is done, right? So how do you define done? That's always the big elephant in the room for QA, right? So ATDD helps to define that. It does not give the end-all, be-all answer, but through the methodology that ATDD provides, you can define done. Any questions?
Are you going to give us an example of that?
Yes. Spoilers. Yes.
In a previous company, when I used to be in an agile team, one of the things that really hit us hard was that development did not design testable slices, because just a screen that's not connecting to a database, how do you test it? How do you verify it? That was hurting it. That was the worst hurt for us.
Sure. Yeah, and actually that's one of the things, we will talk a little bit about that. I did not plant that question, but that was an excellent question. Yeah, so we will talk about things that ATDD can do to help prevent that. We ourselves are actually moving to a microservices architecture where we're going to have to help to define, essentially allows you to have different modules, so that way you don't have one huge massive application and a massive database. You can break up your login, you can break up your database, you can break up several different pieces, but when you do that, that adds complexity to your testing. So we'll talk a little bit about how we've tried to get ahead of that game and what this methodology can do to help prevent that.
Yeah, Adam, will you cover the non-functional testing, performance testing, security, and so forth?
Not in this presentation. It's something that, due to the fact that all of our stuff is hosted on Google Cloud or Azure, we don't focus as much on performance because
you can scale.
Exactly right. Scaling is very, very easy for us. Security is something that we do. However, we partner with other companies that when we get to a point where our code is at a production level stable, we'll partner with a third party to come in and do security and penetration testing for us. It's generally something that, in my experience, I don't recommend a QA team who is not specifically trained in security to try to do security. Unless you're going to provide training, unless you're going to provide tools, it doesn't ever end well, right? So either you purchase a tool, whether it's InSpider or whatnot, or contact another third party, or hire someone who's very specifically trained in security and penetration testing. All right, so ATDD as a solution. Before I came on board at Better Cloud, we were very heavy test-driven development. Test-driven development is a way to approach development with testing in mind. Before you ever write your first level of code, you're actually writing the test. You write the test, you know that it's going to fail, you start writing your code, and the test progressively is going to start passing, right? So that was great for the individual small pieces of functionality. On the devs, on their local box, the test passed, it was great. When everything was combined together and we tried to have a true product flow, we were falling on our faces. And the reason for that is we weren't testing the product. We were not following back up with the user stories to make sure that we truly understood how this piece A is supposed to talk to piece B, see if there's anything wrong with both of those, and test the product. So we did a lot of research and came up with ATDD, and it made sense because ATDD tests the product, and it can work in conjunction with TDD. So we didn't have to take the devs and change their process radically. Nothing on their end changed. In fact, it made their lives a lot easier. What it did is it allowed us as the QA team to start engaging with a series of questions to the product owners, to the folks coming at us with the requirements. So we can start asking now, okay, I see this user story. Now, how do I test this? What are the criteria? that I need to meet to make sure that I can validate that this is done. We'll talk about that a little bit, but ATDD paved the way for us to start engaging with the product team and engaging with the development team before the sprint even started. Again, it provides ways to know that you're done, right? So it provides a method called acceptance criteria, acceptance test, based on those criteria. So that way you know the user story is done, the product team signs off on it, yes, this makes sense, we're good to go. And again, the huge tenet for Agile, communication and collaboration, right? If you're going to move from Waterfall to Agile, you've got to nail communication before you nail anything else, right? And if you have a testing methodology that does not encourage and increase communication, your Agile process is going to fail. It's absolutely going to happen.
So Adam, would you consider that like what I call the old school way of calling it exit criteria?
Not necessarily, because it's more of a way of taking a traditional QA tester and pushing them a bit into the role of an analyst, right? It takes them and allows them to, I come from the school of thought where the QA folks are actually the true SMEs of the product, right? The QA team they're testing it, they're in it every day, and you're not fully utilizing your team if you constantly put them at the end of the process. Right, so this allows you to pull those folks up to the front of the process, allows them to use their SME knowledge to work with the product owners, and it will actually, or the business analysts, whichever ones you want to call them, it will actually alleviate some of the stress that they have trying to come up with all of the scenarios, and it will allow them to work together and allow QA to write their tests and acceptance criteria up front. So you could define acceptance criteria at that point, but it's not quite the same thing.
Excuse me.
Yes?
I've seen that many times. QA is not involved, like you mentioned, from the beginning of the test, from the beginning of the SDLC. So I've seen, in my experience, when business involves QA right from the beginning, and QA understands what's the business wanting from the product, what is it that the user wants. If they understand the business of the product, like what is it that the user is expecting from this, they can QA it.
Yes.
But
Totally agree.
in many organizations, I've seen that that's not the case. They just push us down the drain right when design is done and development starts, which is a really common practice in QA. Unfortunately, in all organizations for QA.
Yeah, I could not agree more, right? So I come from a very old school background, semiconductor hardware industry where QA, we came at the very end testing the firmware, we came at the very end testing the hardware. And I've gradually seen as companies mature, and you're seeing it a lot more with smaller companies who are more agile, able to take a risk. So they say, yeah, let's try a new methodology because a lot of those folks came from a huge company where they couldn't try risk, or the management team didn't understand, we don't need QA talking to product owners, it wastes everyone's time, right? So the reason why we propose ATDD is because it puts a true process name around why the QA needs to talk to the product owner, right? So it starts to help define that, and especially folks on like the management team, they like to see some output, they like to see some documentation of this, right? Where it's not just a discussion between the product owner and the QA team, but you're actually creating acceptance criteria, you're creating acceptance tests. So yeah, I agree, it is a fundamental flaw to keep QA at the very end.
Yeah. But how do you push also QA teams to try to understand the business? I've seen many times QA testers sit in these meetings and they don't even know what's going on. That's the other side. So what do you recommend?
You have to start training your QA folks with business analysis skills. They have to learn risk analysis. They have to learn how to read a requirement and understand it. So not just read a requirement and say, okay, well, I know that I'm going to need 10 steps to verify this and perhaps some boundary and negative testing. We have to take them to that next level of actually allowing them to say, okay, I'm in this product day in and day out. I know how users use this product. So let me take that approach and that mentality and look at the requirement that way. So I see requirement A that the product owner is saying, that's not going to mesh very well because it's going to break this other flow. Like, really only the QA person is going to know that. Perhaps a developer, but mostly it's going to be the QA person. So it's going to have to teach them, you're going to have to teach them analysis skills. And that's one thing, in my opinion, that is missing in a lot of the QA knowledge that we do, right? So we teach QA folks how to write test cases. We teach QA folks, how to dig in and do boundary negative testing, but we never really teach them how to properly analyze requirements to really think critically.
Out of the box.
Yes, out of the box, exactly right.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I was still kind of wrap my brain around how it's set up with you guys.
Sure.
Because one of the companies I worked for, when we instituted Agile, we created what was called a customer team. So that was the product manager, UI specialist, QA. And we would look at their stories and, we'd see some UI so we understood what was happening. And then together we would create acceptance tests there before the dev team even knew what they were doing.
Sure.
And then, so once we were all clear and agreed on all of that, then we presented that to the dev team in our sprint planning meetings. And then, estimated from that point on. So is this kind of what you guys are doing?
It's very, very similar. So I touch on that lightly through here in terms of our overall organization, but the product owner comes up by either speaking with the support team, the marketing team, sales team, or going out and taking a look at competitors, and they figure out what they want to do for the next step, right? For the next step of the product. At that point, they've got a high level, hey, we want to, in the case of Office 365, we want users to be able to go in and modify security settings for SharePoint. And that's really as detailed as they get. At that point, there will be a high-level grooming session with the tech leads or the architects to say, is this even viable? Is it supported by the API, right? Can we now go through and do this? If the answer is yes, at that point, we'll start breaking those into user stories, and that's when we start engaging the whole team, right? So we actually start engaging the whole team relatively early, and one of the ways we're able to do that is we take 6-hour days. So 6-hour days in terms of the actual sprint that we're in. So for me, is where I see teams fall flat most of the time is assuming you can book a sprint team for 8 hours worth of work every single day. That leaves no time to plan for the next sprint. So every day as we're working, with the exception of day one, we're already planning for the next sprint. So we've got 6 hours a day that are devoted to coding and testing. We'll call it sprint 1. And as we're going through there, every other day, we do a planning session, a grooming session, that is about 2 hours, right? So without this, we would not have been able to successfully implement Agile, TDD, ATDD, none of it. Because you can't plan for your next sprint when you're already having to book and work 8 hours a day. 8 hours a day. Does that make sense? So, yes?
So if you have 4 teams and they're all vying for the items on the backlog, do you educate all the QA up front for all the backlog items?
So our QA team is, being that we have one application, we've broken up all of the different teams into color teams. We actually used Expo markers for the teams, so it's very original. But each team has its own backlog. We've got essentially, if you want to call it a super backlog, and we put that in AHA. I don't know if you guys are familiar with AHA at all, but it's essentially a tool for product owners to keep track and to put their ideas so they don't pollute, quote unquote, the actual backlog. We use Jira for our ticket management system. So each team has its own backlog. So essentially what we'll do is we will have, say, okay, team 1, you are going to be focused on this area of the product for the next 4 months. And then they will work off of that backlog for 4 months, and then we will rotate the teams around. And that has worked very, very well for us. One of the unique things that we do as well is we actually take a team, and every 3 months we allocate them to nothing but production bugs. And that's just been a very good test for us, as it were. To answer your question? Someone?
That makes sense. One project I was on is you could have 4 teams all working on one page.
Sure.
And it got kind of hairy at times, and everyone stepped on each other's code. No
So-
one really, was educated on one little section.
So you guys had one massive backlog that everyone was pulling from.
Yeah.
How did you divvy up the sprints?
Everyone sat down and said, I take that item, I'll take that, and I'll take that.
Okay.
So no one had a chance to get really educated. You know, they couldn't become SMEs.
Yeah, and that is tough when you have a lot of teams in the same code base. We had some of the same problem when we were doing our rebranding. Essentially what we did is we set every team had their own team branch, and at certain points, it was whether it was every week on a Friday, every other week or whatnot, we would merge all the branches in together. Right? So that way you didn't have folks who were always stepping all over. You didn't have team 1 checking in changes that broke things for team 4. Right? So a lot of that is just making sure that you've got a lot of good process around your build environments. It is possible for multiple teams to pull from one backlog as long as they're working in their own environment. Right? But when you've got multiple teams checking in code all to the same place, you're constantly going to have problems if you don't have a stable test environment. Hi. Yes.
Sorry, what's
No,
FA?
no.
What's NE?
Oh, sure. Yes. So an FA for us is back to what we were talking about. The analyst is a functional analyst.
Okay.
So that is our manual tester.
Thank you.
We don't call them QA testers because
Thank you.
they're not really testers.
Functional analyst, and NE is
Where are we? Oh,
the bottom?
that is everyone. This little
Just, okay, thank you. And
It's
then,
cut off.
little strange.
so then when you say planning, you're only doing 12 hours of planning for next sprint?
Correct.
Okay, all right.
Correct.
Okay.
And what we found is when the team was trying to learn how to do this, we had to stagger in some sprint training sessions. We used Party Poker for our planning. So when we were going through and the teams were having to learn it, or if we bring on a new team, we have to spin them up, we have to go, and some of those sessions will be 2 to 3 hours. So what we'll do is we'll know, okay, brand new team, so their velocity is going to be less going into their first sprint or two. Right? So it's just, you have to be flexible and you have to understand really who and what you're working with. So we would train them how to write stories, acceptance criteria. We would sit in there with them and talk them through the party and the planning poker. Cool.
I think if you push that door back, it may get rid of that shadow.
No, it's behind.
No,
the
it's
screen.
behind.
The door's
And the
locked. I
door's
went to
locked.
try and move it. but
Very sad.
Didn't
Hopefully
notice it
nothing else
early
is
enough.
down there. Close enough. All right, so user story. Who here is familiar with using user stories? Yes, quite a few folks. Excellent. So as some of you know, and some of you will learn, the user story is the what, right? It is what the business needs. It is what the client is looking for. Oftentimes you'll hear the words personas thrown around with user stories. It's something that we've actually moved into. I used to not be a fan of personas. I used to dread using personas, but it actually works very well for us. This is my persona because I'm a rebel going against the grain. So it is the what. It allows the product owner to not have to worry about, okay, I'm writing this requirement. I need to make sure that I use will instead of should or can instead of has to, right? So you can break away from some of the traditional business analyst, traditional waterfall type requirements that makes it difficult for folks, right? So again, for Agile, this requirement is not complete in and of itself. It should not be. What it should do is it should drive communication and collaboration. Again, those two key tenets of Agile. Drive communication and collaboration, right? So you read this, it's pretty easy to understand what it means. We use the very traditional way from my cone, as a, I want to, so that, right? It's very easy for us to use, very easy to train. Anyone coming in, whether it's the support team, marketing, sales, can create user stories that can go in the backlog. Any questions about why we use user stories, or for those that might not know what they are, any questions about user stories? No? All right. You guys are taking it easy. All right. Acceptance criteria. How we are going to define done. So again, this is one of the things where, as the elephant in the room for QA is always how do you define done, right? So This is our way we do it. It may not be perfect. It may not be the end-all, be-all answer, but it works well for us. So what we do is, in those sprint planning sessions, is we will go through and, with the product owner, with the developer, the tech lead, the QA person will work to define the acceptance criteria. We do not let any user story ever go through the process without acceptance criteria. No exceptions. We won't let folks estimate them without acceptance criteria. We won't let devs work on them without acceptance criteria. And that's including defects as well. So we have a pretty strict defect process. Is when a defect comes in from support, the first thing we do is we have a responsible dev and responsible QA that goes in and creates the acceptance criteria before it can be assigned to any developer to be worked on. And this has been the key differentiator for us. I'll get you in just a second. For us as we move forward into this process, because we are allowed to, in a very plain language, define what that requirement is supposed to accomplish. Yes?
So you're saying your developers and QAs are creating acceptance criteria for the different industries?
Exactly right.
I work for AQAA, and in our company, we do it all together with subject matter expert and PO, and we also have our dev and QA and SME all together, and we create acceptance criteria which is not there already in the user story by background reading for the next few months. I mean, we do pretty much the same thing in our company also, but acceptance criteria is mostly written by the PO because she or he's the one who's going to accept it after the demo. So if we, in my opinion, like if we are the ones creating the acceptance criteria and who's there for accepting it?
So it should be everyone on the product team, everyone on the actual sprint team itself creating the acceptance criteria. The product person does have the final say-so, and they are the one who signs off on it. So that is still the same. However, what we were finding is the product person, when they've got not just one team they may have to support, they may have to support multiple teams. And they're constantly having to write user stories or requirements and go meet with clients and go meet with the other support teams, the other marketing teams. So expecting them to come up with all of these was, for us, it was just irrational because we were finding that we were having a lot of misses.
Another reason we have is we have a lot of contractors and they're kind of new to the application that we use. So that's why it's better to have a subject matter expert or PO to finally decide what should be the acceptance criteria because new contractors might not have that knowledge about it.
Yeah, agreed. And for us, we have our tech lead is really our SME. So they are the one who is very knowledgeable about the area of code. They know the APIs. So they are the ones who provide probably 60% of the information for this, right? Whereas the other team is working on the rest 40%. So yes, having an SME is very, very important if you can afford to do so. So acceptance criteria, this is the big piece. Anyone have any questions around acceptance criteria?
And what did you say, planning? You said during planning sessions, the QA works with?
So we essentially, we get the QA folks, which is both manual and automated, which is absolutely key to have both of them there. And I'll talk about why that in just a little bit. The product owner, whether it's the developer or the tech lead, ideally it's the entire development team who's going to be working on the product. That is your really ideal state. So everyone who's going to then take that work and start actually working through those tickets are responsible for planning out and creating the criteria for your own tickets. Yes, it's close enough. Yes.
So what you're saying, they should go through the acceptance criteria and refine it? Is that what you're saying?
So essentially we explain it. So for those of us who are old school Agile, this is what was on the back of the note cards when we put them on the whiteboards. So on the front you had the user stories, and on the back you turn around and wrote the acceptance criteria, right? So it allows you to understand, define, done, right? Because you've got the user story, which is essentially the business request. It is the business want. So as a paying customer, I want to do a couple of things, so that way you don't, that leaves a lot to be defined, right? It's, okay, so I want to be able to update my billing information. Does that mean update just my billing address, or can I enter in a new credit card number? Can I delete my billing information? Can I have multiple billing addresses, right? So some of this is going back to the business analyst training, where you have to train your team to know what types of questions to ask. So they might not even know all of the questions to ask, but there should be a certain standard in terms of, you teach your team, they go in and they think immediately, okay, let's think positive path first. So what are all the ways that I can interact with this application? I can, edit an address, I can edit a phone number, I can edit X, Y, and Z. And then let's start thinking about the negative next. What are all the ways this can fail? What if our billing system goes down? What if I try to enter in letters and a phone number? What if I, do X, Y, and Z? So it's asking the what ifs. It's asking the how do I do X, Y, and Z? It's asking the, if I update my billing information here, does that affect my account settings on X, Y, and Z page? So, yes?
When you are writing the acceptance criteria, how do you guys write it? Do you write like text-based, like when you say define system behavior? So if your use case says that user wants to update billing information,
Yep.
do you guys write down what is the meaning of updating? Do you guys write all like words, or do you guys have like a design specs? Okay, this is
how we start. So we get on the board and we just start writing, right? It should be a navigation element. User can select to update the billing information, ability to update the billing information of the payment methods, right? So these are some examples of the acceptance criteria. Now, in some circles of Agile, this is as far as some teams go. Is just defining the acceptance criteria. They don't take it to the next level and create acceptance tests. If that works for your organization, that's fine, right? That is acceptable for a lot of folks. I see a lot of dev-only shops go just to this step, and then they start coding, right? You've technically defined done, so you can progress through this, right? So as with any other methodology or process, there's always multiple camps for the way things can be done. So we take it our next step. Again, I'll talk about the reason why. But this is, in some areas, as far as they take it, right? Because now you have essentially further defined how you define done. There we go. Yes?
Yeah, with this approach, how do you ensure reusability of code and usability standards or UX standards, consistency, that type of stuff?
Yeah, so those will be some of the acceptance criteria that we'll go through. If we've got wireframes, we will probably create user stories to verify those wireframes specifically.
Okay.
You can either do it that way, or you can take a look at the test. So maybe one of our acceptance criteria is, all of the elements on wireframe 1, 2, 3, 4 need to be present in the order that are presented on the wireframe. Right? So we tend to create user stories for certain artifacts to make sure that it's just really easier for us to track them.
Okay. What about the reusability of code? Like, let's say you have a common logging function, or certain error codes you want to be consistent across pages or across functions. How do you ensure that?
So if it
or
was
is that
something
even
that,
a consideration?
if it was something that we previously tested, that we know that we're going to be writing code that's going to affect that, we will pull those from our testing repository and essentially create QA stories. So as a QA or as a functional analyst, I want to do regression on the login page.
Really?
Yeah. So we will actually create our own test tickets or test user stories. We actually, all of our test automation, they create their own stories.
Okay. So it's like a testing task.
Yeah. So you can either do it as a task under the user story. So if you're using Jira, you can either do it as a task itself under the user story, or you can create its own user story.
Gotcha.
The reason why we do that is because we track everyone's hours. Everyone, QA, dev, except for the product owner, so not necessarily everyone, does estimates for the tickets and the user stories. All right, so the next step for us, the acceptance test. So where we all love QA, we all love testing, so we have to have something with the word test in it, or it's not QA. All right, so yeah, so those of you who are familiar with behavior-driven development, this will look very familiar. In fact, a lot of the books that if you read on acceptance test-driven development touch on BDD, right? So we were initially struggling on how to take it to that next step. How do we link up our test automation team and our manual team? How do we make them work together in a bit of harmony? So one of the things that we found was if we use the given, when, then format, in the sprint planning meetings, the QA person then goes, they take the requirements, the user stories, the acceptance criteria, create them in a given, when, then format, which allows them to better understand how they're going to do their test. Well, using the technology that we use is we can then automate that very, very easily. Any questions on the given, when, then format? Sir?
Is it the same command as a cucumber on the internet?
Yes. Cucumber or Spock, they both use.
Right.
Spoilers.
This thing about spoilers.
It's a Doctor Who thing if you guys are. All right, so given, when, then, it's very easy to set up again. We wanted to have a way that we could train new QA folks coming onto the team. And using this way, it's very easy for folks to understand, okay, given, that is the state of the system when I'm going to approach it. It is, given the user has already navigated to the login page, when the user wants to perform an action, then this happens. It's clear language. It gives the tester the flexibility to test around and how they want, with the understanding that they still need to write down how they did their testing. But it's clear. It's not 75,000 steps like some of our test cases can be. It's very easy to use. All right, so based on the user story that we had, this is a very simple, very clean way of writing a test for that. So given the customers navigate the billing page, the customer is going to perform an action, and then the customer is presented with happiness. Any questions on the given, when, then format?
Is it very similar to your test case steps like action, expected result?
Exactly.
Something.
Exactly. Yeah, and again, I mean, there's 100 different ways to slice an apple, right? So it's what works for your organization, right? So you can follow this way. You can follow maybe your team, they're more comfortable writing step 1, step 2, step 3. That's fine, right? And that'll actually fit into this. One of the things that we found was, as we were going through this, results, I should have QA'd my own slides. All right, so hold that thought for a second as I talk about results real quick. So one of the things that we found is after we implemented acceptance test-driven development, and we brought every QA member to the forefront to talk in the sprint planning meetings, they really started liking their jobs a lot more. They really started enjoying thinking critically. So they were no longer stuck behind a computer just having to test, just having to write test cases. They were actually able to engage and take that knowledge and bring that forward, right? So they truly became the SMEs, even surpassing the devs and the tech leads. We had the test cases, because we work on 6-hour days and with 2 hours of planning, we no longer had that huge spike in the beginning of our sprint where QA team was having to write their test cases while they were testing and performing all these other actions, because all the tests were done, they were signed off on, they were complete. Both the functional and the automated testers understood what they were supposed to be doing before the sprint even started, which allows the team to focus on more complex tests. So when the team is engaged, when they know what they're supposed to be testing, they can then, as they're going through the first week, as they're going through the first day, start thinking of the what ifs. What if I tried this scenario? What if I tried that scenario? Right? So it allows them to really learn the product. So I know probably quite a few of you know James Bach. So very, very much pushing on the exploratory in the beginning. Very much pushing on the let the QA team learn before they start writing the test cases. In a manner of speaking, we're allowing them to do that by giving them the user stories up front, by giving them the knowledge up front. And one of the things that we've been able to also limit is the overlap between unit integration and acceptance testing. So because dev is scoping out their unit test during sprint planning, they can talk about that with the QA tester. They can say, okay, well, we're going to be connected to this API. QA, there's no reason for you to write a test to make sure that that API is working. We've got an integration test that verifies that, and that runs every single night. There's absolutely no reason why you have to run that test. So it's been able to allow us to really broaden our reach in what we're able to test. Any questions on our manual QA results?
One question.
Yes,
And
of course.
it's not related to manual QA. Suppose you are doing continuous integration along with acceptance. Does it work like every like we do at Pittsburgh? We recently started what is called nightly building automation. So there is no really test cycle there.
Right.
Because every day the commit happens only after the build passes. And then QA is just validating some of the other things. And it's like continuously every day testing. So if that happens, how does the acceptance criteria, how does it fit in? Is it like daily acceptance criteria you look at?
CI is a whole another conversation, but the actual planning would be very similar. So you would still need to plan out, okay, what is going to happen in all those builds? I see a much heavier emphasis on automation for CI, right? And different types of automation. So you've got, consumer-driven, contract tests. You've got all sorts of different types of tests. So it's going to be less manual creating the acceptance test and more creating the criteria for how you're going to create your automated test, right? And then your criteria may be, we need to make sure that this test runs every third night or every integration build or whatnot. So you can still use the same process to plan it out, but CI is its own beast. It really is. I have a link for a guy who does CI testing very well, so I will send that to you because I can't remember his name right now. I'll get that to you. Was there another question? Yes, sir.
What we have created for our QA and developers, we do QA impact list. So like someone is fixing a code in job portal, we have personal information portal, payroll portal, and we find out where is it impacting. So if it's a new QA, he doesn't have to worry about where should I write the test cases and the test scenarios. You can only go there and find out if these are the things that might affect, and I need to check all these scenarios based on that. Do you also recommend something in your process?
Yeah, it's one thing that I don't mention here that we do is a risk analysis. So based on code changes, it's much heavier in our defect fixing process where we do the risk analysis. We don't have one master document that we pull from. We actually put those details into JIRA and into the ticket itself. But as part of our sprint planning process, as part of our acceptance test creation, we do our risk analysis, especially if we're going to be working on legacy code, which we all love to work and test on. That is one thing that we try to work very heavily to do.
I work with defects.
I'm sorry.
All the defects are and I have to find out who's going to work on what and how. So for defects is really crucial to do all the testing.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we don't split up defects amongst a whole bunch of teams. Why it's worked very well for us to have a defect team and we cycle them out so we don't burn them out. But it allows them to really become, and it's the added benefit of when you have a QA person who's able to test on so many various parts of the application, they really become a true SME. So we have to drag them through it, but at the end of it, they enjoy the knowledge. You doing good on time?
You're good?
Awesome. All right, so our results for our automated QA. This door is really... so what we decided to do was, since we were pursuing the line of given, when, then for our acceptance test creation, is we decided to look to see what would work best with that. So a few folks in here have mentioned Cucumber. We have decided to use Groovy, and we use Spock with Groovy. And the reason why we use Spock is because the tests are written in a given, when, then format. So what this does is it allows the test automation fellow, which we call software engineering test. I think I heard another name, which excellent name, by the way, because they really are engineers, right? So they're coders, right? We actually do reviews. We take our development architects, and they actually review the code of our sets. Because what that does is it allows them to grow in their coding skills. So we treat them as developers, and it's very important that if you have test automation folks, or you're trying to build a test automation team, to treat them like developers, right? They need to have check-ins. They need to have their own branches. They need to have their own ability to work as a dev. Otherwise, your automation team will fail.
Hallelujah.
Dun, dun, dun.
Hallelujah. That's all I got to say.
So we'll talk a little bit about, I'll show you a quick code snippet for what we use, Groovy and Spock. So we use Jeb for essentially our Selenium wrapper. So it is Selenium based for those of you who are trying to learn Selenium or have already know it. So as I mentioned down here that everyone can so excellently read, it has drastically reduced the amount of time from the automation team writing their test than when we were not using given, when, then. Because what they can do is, in this sprint planning session, they can go ahead and write their given, when, then. They can mock out their test, they can write everything up, and as soon as the dev has it built, they can immediately hook it up and it's ready to go. Right? So no longer is our automation team an entire sprint behind, perhaps 2 sprints behind. They are working and writing their test and running their test at the exact same time our manual folks are running their test. Yes?
All right, so what we face in our team is end of the sprint, when my manual tester creates the test, test cases and everything. And most of the time, my developers fix all this defect probably at the end of the sprint. And what happens if you're doing automation, if it's not really fixed, you don't get that component in there. Like sometimes you need to add a warning message or something like that. So how do you cope up with it? Because that's how we always ended up doing it for the next sprint. Because if you want to do it in the same sprint, you have to make these things accepted first.
Right.
Without that, automation cannot go beyond, you have to make it fixed first. Otherwise, you cannot automate the whole script, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it sounds like you guys are using a small waterfall method inside of your agile process where you're fixing the bugs at the end, right? That is not only bad for the automated testers, but it's terribly helpful for the manual testers, because it increases a large amount of risk with as many fixes as you're introducing at the end of the sprint. Typically, at the end of our sprints, is we've got a code freeze, which is what we all love to hear and none of us ever see. Right, so that's something that we try to shoot for, is that code freeze. So it's really, with Agile, and the true tenets of Agile is being able to essentially do small little micro releases of functionality into the environment, is we have an automation task associated to the ticket, and when the dev flips that ticket over, we know that that message is ready. We know that that login path of that function is ready to be tested. So we rely very heavily on devs, and we work very heavily with them, is as they're breaking up their stories, and we use the invest method. You guys familiar with invest? Highly recommend looking it up if you are not familiar with using invest of your user stories. So essentially, the way that you can break the user stories up, you guys are going to put me on the spot here. So each story is independent, negotiable, estimatable, verifiable, right? Viable, something.
Verifiable.
Verifiable, small and testable, right? So what we do, we actually printed out 105 copies of some of the employees we have and put them up in everyone's. Well, we have an open environment, so we stuck them in their monitors and took them But essentially, we put them up around the office, and we put them in the rooms that we use for our sprint planning meetings, along with our personas, along with our guidelines for sprint planning, along with how to do party poker. The instructions are up on the wall, right? So that way you can go and look, okay, I've got this story, doesn't meet these criteria, right? And it's the QA's responsibility to work with the devs and hold them accountable as they're breaking up their task and as they're breaking up their stories. If you can't test it, why are we creating it, right?
It's not Moscow.
Right. So, you know, and that's
Sorry,
one thing.
best.
Yeah, exactly.
Slice the database.
Yes. So, you know, and it may be something that the dev creates a task. So we help them then create the unit test for it. We don't code the unit test, but we ensure that it's actually tested, right? And that is the QA person's responsibility. Absolutely. So I work to try to empower my folks to say, okay, when you go in there, it is your responsibility to make sure that every story in there can be tested. If it can't, stand up and challenge.
I think what we're doing wrong is we have fine-tuned the workload chart, and
Very important.
that's, I mean, our Scrum Masters kind of like, not that expert in that level to maintain the rundown chart, because our acceptance criteria, we're fixing the problems, and all of a sudden something comes up and we change the acceptance criteria.
Yeah. So we do not allow acceptance criteria or user stories to change in the middle of the sprint.
Well, what if it's really important one and we didn't add it, and the developer fixed it, and then we have to add that line in the acceptance criteria?
So if it's a result of a bug fix, right, so then we will obviously add acceptance criteria for the bug fix. If we get into the middle of a sprint and the story is so complex that we can't figure it out, we rip it out of the sprint. Because what happens is we wind up working on it, we get to 8 o'clock on a Friday night, and we're still trying to do our release, right? And nobody's unhappy, there's a huge amount of risk. So we are, when, you know, you hear a lot of folks say they're hardcore Scrum, they're hardcore Agiles. You know, we actually are. We are very, very tough on the devs, the product owners, and even our QA folks of not introducing new functionality in the middle of a sprint, of not allowing things to radically change in the middle of a sprint. If you're going to that sprint and you do not understand that story, you should not be giving it estimates, and it should not go into the sprint, right? So, and that's really the key around you know, the acceptance criteria and the acceptance test. So that way you can truly understand it.
Maybe,
Yes. Hi.
it's probably a function of QA not being involved early enough, but like we'll get into a sprint, like the user story you should be able to hit billing and hit change address. Okay, so how do I get out of it? Like all of that will be missing from the sprint. Like you can hit the back button, you can hit the X on the pop-up for the address change. You can hit the address change again and it should toggle off, or, you know, what if you hit refresh, does it go away? The business person is thinking about the need to change address.
Right.
And so you'll get all the way into a sprint and it'll tell all the stuff it should pop up and do, say, but not how do you get out of there? And you can't install it without a way to get out of there. What if you get in there and, oh, that's the right address, I don't want to change it after all? Or what if you do change it, do you hit submit? You know, what if you hit the back button without submitting? Like,
Right. And so one of the things.
so
that
you
we
would
do-
pull that sprint.
Yeah, I mean, so we would pull a ticket out if we didn't understand it, or we would have to roll that over into the next sprint. So one of the things that we do to help prevent that is I have my manual testers and my automated testers sit together before the sprint planning session and they review the user stories. They start coming up with scenarios. They bounce scenarios off of one another to come up with these types of ideas. So that way we can go into it already saying, okay, there we have a login scenario, you know, let's ask our 50,000 questions. Because that is the time. We don't say that's a stupid question or you don't have time to ask questions. That is the time to ask questions, not in the middle of the sprint. Make sense? So I've got a couple of minutes left. Wanted to go over real quick what we call GGS, Jet Groovy Spa. As you can see, and it may be a little bit difficult to see. If you guys can't see it, then I'm happy to talk it over with you when I'm done. But we've got given, in very plain language, the actual code. when, and then. Most of this can be done before there's ever the developer code ready, right? We can understand, okay, what are you going to call the button? What are you going to call the method? Hey, dev guy, we may not have a UI, but we know what we're going to call it. We know what that functionality is going to happen. So I can go ahead and in a TDD manner method, create this and run it, and it will fail, and we want to see it fail. And then we can keep running it until it actually passes, right? So again, keeping the teams hand in hand, in harmony, communication, collaboration, right? Very, very important. So this has really brought our automated team to the forefront and allowed them to participate, be an active participant in the actual sprint planning process.
For a given, you can have multiple wins
Yes.
and multiple thens, right?
Yes.
Because that's how it is.
Yeah.
Login can have several negative functional
Mhm.
performance, everything.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. 2 more slides and then I'm done. I may run about a minute or so over. Hopefully that's all right. You guys are asking excellent questions. Thank you very much. So, one of the things that I always push is the failures of an automation team is trying to stick to your tool. It is trying to stick within the bounds of what your tool is able to do. So, a couple of rumors that I want to dispel about automation, especially folks who are trying to build their automation team or trying to figure out how to take it to the next step. Do not regulate your automation folks to the tools that they're using. Let them think outside the box. Let them think about creative solutions to the problems. This one right here, absolutely huge for us. So, yeah, so one of our automated guys on the Microsoft side was seeing one of our manual testers struggle because she had to create 3,000 accounts to do testing to stress out our login process. 3,000 accounts. So our automated guy said, well, I think I can create that in a PowerShell command. So he took about 45 minutes and with, a while true do, loop through and create a whole bunch of email addresses and accounts, reduced the entire 3-day effort to 2 hours. Wow. Right? Because he took his developer knowledge, he was assigned to the QA team as his responsibility, and enhanced that effort. Another thing that we did, so we created a Chrome extension. When we went through our rebranding effort, we changed the name of our product from Flash Panel to Better Cloud. It was a product that's been around for about 3 years, as you can tell. The word Flash Panel was probably in there about 7,000 times, whether it was button names, whether it was the behind the images or whatever it could have been, URLs. Again, the entire QA team was going to have to go through the entire application and verify if the words Flash Panel were removed. Well, we just created a Chrome extension that would look at the DOM on every single page and look for the word Flash Panel. Cut the initial time down by 75%. Neither one of those are an automation tool at all, right? They're both free as well, which is great. I love the word free. A couple of the other things that we do is we've just started using fitness. So those of you familiar with SOAP UI, using JMeter. So these are things that allow your team to go out and think and be creative to solve solutions to problems that you're having. And pull them together. Have a QA meeting and say, okay, manual tester, what do you spend 60% of your day testing? Well, I log in and I go to this page and I verify that. Why can't we automate that? Or why can't we have a process to create your email accounts or whatever? One of the things that we're also doing for the automation team is metrics. We all love metrics. We all think to report on metrics, right? If you've ever tried to export a Jira CSV file to Google Sheets, I'm sorry. It's awful. It's terrible. But Jira's got a REST API. And what are automation guys useful at doing? Working with REST APIs. So we had one of our automation folks create an interface between Google Sheets and Jira using the REST API. Again, solved the problem, something that was manual, that was a huge pain, and was able to fix it.
You'll create acceptance criteria, and you'll automate the test for that, and the automated test will run kind of forever, right? but that acceptance criteria over time might change. So how are you guys handling it? Are you killing the original and creating something new, or?
So we use our acceptance tests. We use Q-Test from QA Symphony, but you can use anything, test Rails, HP, whatever. We use that as our source of truth, essentially. So if acceptance criteria change to a point that the acceptance test changed, well, we try to go back and change the test, to update the test to reflect that. So that way we know we have a solid system of record for that. So in some cases, we may have that acceptance test linked directly to the actual automated test. So very, very much often we're trying to get to the point where we don't get into the fact that we have to write the manual test to write the automated test, because the automated test is the one, can supplement that. So we use the test case repository as our source of truth, essentially. So if we have changes, that's what we do.
So you'll change what already existed rather than...
We will. Yeah, and we've got, what we try to do is, for our test automation folks, is we set aside a certain number of hours a week. So we shorten their velocity a little bit to go back. So one of our folks has created something we call Stashboard. Essentially, it's a graphic interface for us to see which tests are passing and failing. And we have our test automation folks they have their own backlog. And so what they'll do is each automation person will pull a certain number of tests every week and go in and refactor those based on changes. And then once they do that, they'll update the test in Q-Test.
Okay.
Final thoughts. Include your test automation team early and often. Absolutely critical, absolutely key. Don't think inside the tool. Don't get caught up on, should we use Cucumber, should we use Groovy, should we use this? Find the problem and solve that problem. Don't shove in a tool thinking it will solve all your problems. If you do everything else wrong and do these two things right, you'll have a mostly successful team. Absolutely critical. And I've been in the QA world since the mid-90s. I've been hearing ever since then that manual is going away and automation is the way of the future. That's not the case, right? If you do not have those two teams working together, you're doing it wrong. So I think that's